So today we have the absolute pleasure to be hearing a presentation by Dr. Tracey Meyers, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with expertise in neuropsychological assessment, psychotherapy, including trauma-informed therapies, and positive behavioral planning. In addition, Tracey has extensive training in integrative medicine modalities to support optimal mental health. She is an advanced yoga instructor and yoga therapist. She's certified to teach MBSR, iRest, breath, body, mind, and also lectures across the country and internationally on different integrative medicine topics for healing. She authorized several publications and book chapters around holistic behavioral treatment for mental health conditions. She recently wrote a book called Yoga Therapy and Mental Health. She describes, which describes how yoga can be an important part of the recovery journey for people with mental health and traumatic brain injuries. Tracey is on staff at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, a legal assistance program for lawyers, judges, and law students, providing mental health support and well-being coaching. She's a senior facilitator for Studio B, a digital well-being solution to companies, nonprofits, and individuals who are that are rooted in mindfulness, and is part of the faculty at the Maryland University of Integrated Health and the Center for Integrative Yoga Studies. So I will now pass on over to Dr. Meyers.
Thanks, Marissa. And I also worked for DMHAS for 17 years. I was the director of behavioral intervention services at Connecticut Valley Hospital and Whiting Forensic Institute. So have definitely done my share of de-escalation. So I'm happy to talk about this topic today and hopefully share a little bit about it in a holistic way. So you'll hear some of the influences around mindfulness, self-compassion, compassionate listening in the presentation as well. It's a big topic, right? When we think about de-escalation, we only have an hour or so, hour and 15 minutes to talk about it today, but hopefully to think about it maybe in a little bit broader ways and then some specific ways beyond what we typically get in some of our DMHAS trainings. I know when I started at CVH in 2003, we had our CSS training. It was called something else back then. And it was primarily around, learning physical techniques for restraint and seclusion, some de-escalation pieces, but not a lot about how do we manage what's happening inside of us? Like when a client is activated or stressed or becoming aggressive or violent, what do we do with what's happening inside? And then how we might be able to use some of those inner cues to help us de-escalate. So we're going to weave some of those themes into our talk today, along with some other strategies, some practical strategies to consider, and a few real on-the-ground tools. Okay, and then I'm really happy to hear at the end, we'll save time for questions and answers and any sharings that you all would like to do as well. So the title really is about compassionate connections, because when we think about de-escalation, we want to be able to do it in a compassionate way, but also to really try to establish the connection with the person that we're working with. So we'll kind of have that as our overview term that we'll be working with today. So we're going to talk about basic definitions of de-escalation, and then talk really about I want to hone in on this particular therapeutic presence, which of course goes beyond de-escalation, but can be a foundation of much more successful interventions when clients are struggling. We're going to look a little bit from a behavioral lens. As I said earlier, I was the director of behavioral intervention services at CVH for about 10 years. And part of what I would do in my position would be often talking to staff, frontline staff, managers, whoever was working with clients about understanding what the behavior was representing. What did the behavior actually mean? So often we would see behaviors and people would say, oh, I have no idea why the person's doing that. It came out of nowhere. We're going to talk a little bit more about what are the functions of behavior? How can we look at the behavior through a more clinical lens? Talk about emotion regulation and emotion dysregulation, which usually is the underpinning for why an aggressive episode happens. And then we'll talk about this idea of proactive and reactive strategies, and then a little piece at the end about crisis management. So a lofty, ambitious agenda, but we'll see how much we can get through today. So de-escalation, you all are very familiar with these terms, right? If we look at the Joint Commission's terms, there's a lot of different ways that we could look at de-escalation: conflict resolution, crisis resolution, talking down, diffusing. When we think about it, it's really often a combination of strategies. And think about in your settings, what do you do when someone's upset or agitated? It's often not just one thing, right? It can be listening, it can be breathing, it could be reframing, it could be getting additional people to support. So it's usually a combination of strategies helping a person to reduce their level of agitation and aggression. And the foundation of de-escalation, again, is the rapport with the person. And this is a piece that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, right? How do we develop rapport, hopefully before there is a de-escalation moment, so that we can utilize that when we're interacting with the person? The goal for de-escalation, right? Helping the individual regain control, promoting safety and respect. So those are ones we're pretty familiar with, right? And so why do we need to use de-escalation? Well, usually it's in regard to agitation, right? So an acute behavioral emergency. And we know, and I know, many of you as being in DMHAS, we really have reduced restraint and seclusion use, involuntary medication, and this bigger emphasis over the past several decades, really, about how to have a non-coercive approach. And that often the outcomes are much, much better, less traumatizing to the individuals we're working with, and even the potential to create, more change, better change for the person. So let's start with, and I've divided this into 5 different sections, again, with this idea of looking at these building blocks when we're thinking about de-escalation. So the first is this idea of rapport, creating therapeutic presence. So what is this idea of therapeutic presence? And it really, we can define it pretty simply, right? It's how we're with somebody, right? And think about it, it doesn't just have to be in a clinical setting, it can be with your family members even. But like, presence is really being with someone, but it involves something inside of us. And what does that mean? Well, it means being attuned to what's happening inside of us, and at the same time, attuning to the person in front of us. So as clinicians, we often kind of feel those inner cues, right? We feel that gut feeling when someone is upset or distressed. We feel resonance when someone's sad, right? We've got a lot of these little cues that we don't always tune into as actively as we might. So one of the ways that we can think about therapeutic presence is this balance of tuning into ourselves and also really looking at how the other person is feeling as well. And so the more that we can attune to what's happening inside of us, and the more that we're able to, really tune that barometer, the more we actually develop therapeutic presence. And that allows us to be more grounded, open, and connected, right? I love Maya Angelou's quote. Many of you are familiar with this. People may forget what you've said, yet they never forget how you made them feel. And as clinicians, it's really important. We learn a lot of skills. You guys are doing trainings and all these different techniques. But at the bottom line, when we look at what helps people, what kind of therapeutic modalities are most successful, it's much more about the relationship, about how you made the person feel. And what underlies how you make a person feel is your ability to hold presence, or inability sometimes, right? So one of the things we can do over and over again is to remember to check in to what's happening inside of us. And we'll talk about a couple of tips to help us remember to do that. So Sherry Geller has written a book all about therapeutic presence, which I really appreciate. And she talks about this acronym. I love acronyms because it just helps to remind us of, how do we do that? So we're going to work on this little presence acronym, which I think you might find helpful. But this idea is when we practice presence, and there are a couple of skills that we'll learn in presence, it helps us to really reset and develop rapport with whoever we're interacting with, whether it's someone we're seeing on a regular basis or whether it's just someone that we're passing by that in the hallway, where we want to be able to help a person to recognize that we're here, we're open, we're able to support them. So it's really helpful as clinicians to be able to do this on a regular basis. So let's talk about what it is. So here's our acronym, right? So the first thing, and this is like one thing we often forget because you may be seeing people back to back or you've got busy schedules, and the reset before you start to interact with somebody is so important. And I love the idea. This whole presence practice can take 2 minutes, right? It doesn't have to be a long practice, but it is pausing for a moment and just putting aside what you're doing. So let's all try this now, just to kind of practice this way to come home to yourself, right? So pausing, just seeing if you can soften, relax your facial muscles, your body muscles. Probably already you're noticing a little tension. I do in my shoulders, checking out your hands. And then taking a few breaths, enhancing your awareness of breath, maybe feeling the breath moving in the body. Takes about 3 breaths to begin to change that sort of sympathetic arousal to coming into more of a parasympathetic relaxation. So about 3 breaths. And then take a moment to sense how you're feeling inside. Just noticing any physical sensations in your body. Just maybe noticing your emotions right now. How are you feeling this morning? You might even ask yourself, how am I doing? And, maybe there's some thoughts that come up as you tune in. And then beginning to expand your awareness to what's happening around you. So if your eyes were closed, just looking around the room, maybe sensing the presence of each other and me on the call. And noticing what's true right now for you. Do you feel anxious, nervous, grounded, excited, present? And then the last part is to really kind of get yourself grounded. So imagine you're about to launch into your day, your session with somebody, walk into the building where you are, start a meeting. Just feel your feet on the floor. Feel the core, the center of your body. You might even gently just kind of engage, pulling the navel in toward the spine, getting nice and long, just feeling yourself. I'm here, I'm present. And then beginning to get ready, right? Preparing, imagine making eye contact with the person, staying connected. So I drew this out a little bit. Maybe I did it about 5 minutes, but this practice is really helpful as you start because now you're ready. You're not lost in your thoughts, already kind of thinking about the next thing to do or still ruminating about something in the past, right? So this is a piece that can really help us begin our work with our clients. And so how does it affect our clients when we do presence? So number one, our clients' defenses drop away because we're more active and engaged. When a client perceives that we're here and we're listening, that already takes away some of the, defensiveness or reluctance to talk, right? And clients' nervous systems begin to calm down in resonance with the therapist or clinician. And I want to highlight this number 2. This is probably the most important thing we can talk about today. Client's nervous system begins to calm in resonance with our own system. Remember walking on the floors of CVH, and I remember actually standing behind, like outside the door, and I could hear noise, I could hear lots of things happening, and before I would even swipe my badge, taking like 5 breaths. And I knew that like the more that I could start out calm, that when I would come into contact with someone, and usually it was right at the door, that my nervous system would signal to the other client's nervous system, hey, it's okay, it's okay. So the more that we can do that, we have these what's called mirror neurons, where when we're interacting with someone, we can feel how they're feeling. Well, our clients have that too, right? So when we can use ourselves as this sort of calm, grounded, stable person, people feel that, right? When you're in presence with somebody that is calm, that it helps you feel calm. Our bodies know that. So the more that we can be in attunement with ourselves, and that can also support clients. And then the more that we're also attuned to the client too. So it's this like bi-directional, we're attuned to ourselves, we're attuned to the client. Immediately, we're kind of getting them to come into a much more regulated state. And we're not even saying anything at this point, right? It's just our own ability to be tuned in and calm, and then watching and seeing how the person is doing. So this is where we begin to develop therapeutic presence, right? And that can help people already feel a little bit more safe, a little bit more grounded. So again, therapeutic relationship, this can reduce suffering. That alone, just being stable in our own practice, open and attuned, rather than even thinking about any techniques yet. So 3 other things to consider. So if we do our presence, right? So we're grounded and attuned. And then, this idea, and this goes back to Carl Rogers, right? Do these 3 terms look familiar to many of you, right? Carl Rogers talked about these 3 keys to a therapeutic relationship. And Carl Rogers, humanistic psychologist in the 1960s, he comes after this wave of behaviorism where the therapeutic relationship wasn't even discussed. It was just like, oh, you just have to reinforce the behavior by, providing a behavioral reinforcer or punishment, et cetera. And there's a little piece of that in this presentation because there are some helpful behavioral interventions. But what Skinner and many of the behaviorists forgot or didn't include was the fact that having a therapeutic relationship can enhance some of those techniques. So Rogers in the 60s talks about these 3 techniques that are all about this therapeutic relationship: self-congruence, being open; unconditional positive regard, this idea of warmth. It makes a huge difference, right? Because think about how clients' defenses drop when they can perceive warmth in us. And then empathy, right? Empathic understanding, being able to show care. These 3 things, along with the therapeutic relationship, are setting the stage for the possibility of easier de-escalation if someone's getting agitated, or reducing the risk at all. So that's the foundation, right? We've kind of have this therapeutic relationship. We're tuning into ourselves. And now the next part is active listening. And so I want to spend a little bit of time now as clinicians. All of you know about active listening. It's kind of in our like grad school 101, right? But I want to talk about it with even a little bit more of a mindful lens. So Thich Nhat Hanh, many of you are probably familiar with his beautiful work. He was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who was in exile, created a whole mindfulness community in France at a beautiful meditation center called Plum Village in France. And he was a prolific writer and talked all about compassionate mindfulness. And I love his book, The Art of Communicating. Great short little book, if you're ever interested. He talks about, I'm listening to this person in front of him with only one purpose: to give this person a chance to suffer less. And although he wasn't a psychologist, right, or a clinician, really he is, right? Isn't that the heart of what we do? And so to remember that by listening, really listening, that can help the person suffer less. So active listening is part of this healing presence because it lets someone know that we really care. And the interesting thing is, we all think we're good listeners, right? But as humans, with our own struggles, worries, concerns, etc., we often get distracted, right? Of course. We could be listening to someone and then immediately we're like, oh, I hope my kid got off to school okay. Oh, God, I hope I didn't get an email, right? We're kind of conditioned to worry and come out of the present moment. It happens all the time. And that's why the presence acronym is really important, to be able to catch yourself, because when we do that, we're actually not listening. We're tuned out and it happens so quickly, but our facial expressions change, our eyes change when we're not as active listening, and people pick up on that, right? So that internal dialogue that happens to all of us can actually be a barrier to active listening. And we think we are doing it. We don't even catch it. So when we do the presence, we come back into the present moment, tune back into how we're doing. It helps us then to be aware so we can really listen. So these are things, and this, but I think it's helpful to kind of go over it again because there are times where we can forget. And I spent a lot of time watching interactions. Part of my job at CVH, in addition to training staff and working with clients, was just to watch, to kind of be an observationalist and see how did staff interact with clients, how did clients interact with staff. And what I found often was how we spoke, right? The prosody. How do we use our voices to communicate interest and care, right? That could play a big role. It can be to say, I understand what you're saying, or I understand. If you're saying it like, yeah, I get it, I understand, right? Obviously, that doesn't feel like active listening. That feels like you're impatient. Versus, yeah, I totally get that. Well, that sounds really hard, right? So we can use our verbal cues to convey active listening. And that also helps the client know that we're listening. So these are things that in the service of developing rapport, creating that connection, the more that we're able to do this on a regular basis. This also can be a reactive strategy in a crisis. And we're going to circle back to this at the end today of some crisis management strategies, and it relates to some of this too. Now, what about our nonverbals? So the interesting thing is, just like active listening, if you ask most people, we kind of think, oh yeah, I look like I'm paying attention. You know, with Zoom these days, we do get to get some feedback because we can look at ourselves, right? And you can even look at your little box now and kind of see, does it look like I'm paying attention, right? What's my facial expression look like? Am I open and, you know, do I look open and receptive, or am I a little bit shut down? Am I looking away? You know, what are my mannerisms look like? How do I convey to someone that I'm listening? And even the use of silence, right? So can I pause and let people talk? So this is one of the things I learned way back in my grad school training. I was working at the VA in Miami, and we had, back in the day, had to record our sessions on little tape recorders. So I'm very much dating myself, right? And so I'd take the session and I'd have to bring my little tape recorder to my supervisor, and then she'd listen to it, and then she'd stop my tape at different junctures. So I felt like I remember the session with her very clearly. I was doing what I thought was this fabulous intervention with this client. I was talking and teaching and just thought so wise. Which, anyway, she stops the tape in the middle. She says, you know, Tracey, you should have stopped about 3 or 4 sentences earlier. And I was like, oh, and I remember that so vividly because I thought I was really showing care and listening. Meanwhile, I was talking too much. So what is that like, to be able to stop talking and actually listen, to sort of take a moment before we go on to the next thing? Often when we do that, the client's able to process even more fully. And when we do that, we're not in this interrupting back and forth, right? It can be deeply relaxing to just give someone space. So just want to remind us of that piece. All right, so questions or comments so far about anything about therapeutic presence or active listening, anything about that before we move to sort of part 2? So we're sort of putting all of these pieces together when we think about de-escalation. All right, so this is like a little bit of the behaviorist part, right? So that my behavioral hat is on now. The first part was much more sort of the clinical, a little bit of the mindfulness. Let's talk behavior now, which is another really important piece when we're talking about de-escalation. So every behavior has a context and an outcome. Every behavior has a context and outcome. So why is that important? Often we think that someone's behavior is coming out of nowhere. It seems random, it seems out of the blue. And so when we think about a behavior, let's say someone is yelling, right? It is very helpful to recognize that there is a reason why someone is yelling. It's not random, it's not out of nowhere. Even if we don't know what the reason is, we want to assume and we want to understand the function of the behavior. So as a good behaviorist, we always want to think about what is the context and what is the outcome of the behavior and why is it happening? And then if we think about behaviors, and this is a very broad idea, but every behavior really can be broken down into adaptive behaviors and maladaptive behaviors. Think about it for yourself this morning, right? As you got up today, you probably did many adaptive behaviors. You might have eaten breakfast, maybe you got to exercise or meditate this morning, took out your dog, got your kids to school. All these things are really adaptive. Helps yourself, helps other people. And then maybe you had a couple of maladaptive behaviors. Maybe you snoozed. Maybe you didn't eat breakfast because you were rushing, right? Maybe you sped on the highway because you were late to work, right? We had some maladaptive behaviors, right? So all of us kind of have these balance throughout our days of adaptive behaviors and maladaptive. And if we can think about that in a non-judgmental way, we could just recognize, oh, as humans, we're constantly sort of managing adaptive things that help us and then maladaptive things that don't help us. All right. So if we think about this, right, so that's our broad understanding. And then every behavior has a purpose. And our job when we're working with people is to try to understand why it's happening. Because when we do that, then we can target the intervention, right? And so if we know why Joe is screaming on the unit, on inpatient unit, right? If we figure out, oh, actually, Joe is in pain, right? He's having pain this morning. So Joe screams in the morning because his meds have worn off and he's actually having a lot of back pain. Then our intervention can target that, right? But if we don't know why Joe is screaming, we might medicate him with a psychotropic medication, right? Or we might say, Joe, be quiet, or else you're not gonna get breakfast this morning. Whatever. These are examples that hopefully aren't happening, but could happen, right? If we don't match the intervention with the function of behavior, we often see that behavior increases or the person remains in distress. And if someone's in distress, we may see other maladaptive behaviors. So we can't create any kind of behavioral strategy unless we know why the behavior is happening. And so this is often a problem, right? Because we'll often look at the trying to stop the behavior without actually looking at what the intervention is and whether it matches that, right? And so many, many times I'd be asked, all right, well, we got to get so-and-so to stop doing this. But when we ask, well, why, often the nursing staff or whoever would say, I don't know why he's doing it. So that's another really helpful thing to consider is what is the purpose of the behavior? This slide's really, I think, a helpful one to consider, right? Why do people engage in maladaptive behaviors? So possible reasons why a maladaptive behavior can happen. And think about a behavior with a client that you've seen or interacted with, right? And then we'll see if you can maybe find which of these 4 boxes it might fit into. And sometimes it's more than one box, right? Sometimes the function of the behavior, the reason the person's engaging that behavior is to communicate something. Joe is screaming, he's communicating something. And when we find out is he's in pain, right? So sometimes it's a way to communicate when someone doesn't either have the capacity to verbalize why, they don't know themselves, or it's a shortcut way, to get their need met. So sometimes a maladaptive behavior is a communication device. Sometimes it modulates internal distress, right? Think about a classic example, someone who cuts, right? Someone who may engage in self-harm behaviors. It often is modulating intense emotional distress. And so the behavior itself, while maybe maladaptive, is serving a function. If someone finds that it provides relief after cutting or self-harming, they feel better, that makes sense, right? You can understand that. Sometimes it modulates physical distress. We often see, especially elderly clients, clients who are nonverbal, that have difficulty expressing themselves, they may be in pain. And so the behavior is really around pain, distress. And then the last one, it's socio-environmental control. If someone engages in a behavior because they don't feel like they have control in other ways, they will sometimes use the behavior as a way to manage the control, right? And so I was working with a client the other day, and she was dropping her little daughter off at kindergarten. And her daughter really, really struggles with the transition. And so her daughter starts to cry. And the longer she cries, the longer the drop off comes, and mom gives her more hugs, and she gets a lot more soothing, and there's more and more interaction. And so she's getting a lot of support. And so she's managing her little control, right? That's a way to manage control, and probably also to modulate internal distress, and maybe to communicate. Maybe there's 3 of those things that are happening. What happens though is that it gets reinforced, right, over time. And so one of the goals I was working on with my client was, okay, how to help her to feel more in control. How does she modulate her internal distress in a way that gets her to school and doesn't make mom late for work as well, right? But we have to understand what the behavior is underlying. So these 4 things can be really helpful so that you can match the intervention with the behavior that you're trying to support. One of the things that, well, these are kind of some other tips to think about. What's helped in the past? That really does help. So sometimes people will use strategies that never help, right? If it never helps to bring someone a glass of water, why would we keep doing that? We want to see what are things that have been predictably relaxing or giving someone some ease or space. what was the person thinking and feeling before the behavior happens? And I'll ask people that, like, what was going on in your mind before you self-harmed? Does the person have the ability to control their behavior? And this was a big question we would ponder in DMHAS often, right? When people have serious and persistent mental health challenges, right? Can they control their behavior? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is yes, right? Can the person served identify other strategies? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. When the answer is no, that means that we have to do more environmental strategies. If the answer is yes, then teaching and guiding is going to be more of the key. Does the person have skills necessary to perform the new behavior? If we ask somebody to remember to do your breathing exercises and they don't remember, they don't have the skills to do that, right? And then what modifications in the environment are helpful, right? And so always looking at the person's abilities and skills. And I would see this often at DMHAS where we'd have clients that actually didn't have some of the skills, and yet we were expecting them to regain control. So the skill teaching is really key, skill teaching to the level that the person is capable of. So don't assume, and this is one of the things I would often tell staff, and this is hard to do when someone's really aggressive, right? And I don't want to say that any of this is like easy, but when someone is, out of control, there was an assumption, I would hear this often, that the person was doing it for attention seeking, they were doing it on purpose. These were the two most common things I'd hear from staff. And one of the things I like to remind people is their cognitive capabilities and their emotional regulation capabilities may not really allow them to regain control easily. So we often see that behavioral problems are related to frontal executive functioning in the brain, like difficulty delaying gratification, difficulty controlling impulses, difficulty with frustration tolerance. That doesn't mean that people can't learn these skills, but they may not have them, right? Or they may have particular brain issues that make it more difficult for them to learn them. So that brings me to the brain. Many problems in our brain development or subsequent problems, if someone's had a brain injury, can impact our capacity to regulate our moods, to control our behavior. And we know this, but yet we forget that when we're in the middle of it, right? That someone often doesn't have the capacity. And sometimes I would remind staff and go through, maybe if we had a psychological or neuropsychological evaluation, to even look at that and say, hey, do you know that John, I'll keep using the name John, his IQ is 65, which means that he doesn't always have good control over XYZ. And his memory skills are impaired. They're 2 standard deviations below the norm. So he's not able to retain information unless you repeat it many, many times. So we want to understand someone's brain functioning as well when we're thinking about de-escalation, right? Do they have the capacity to remember and use strategies? And are they able to utilize frontal lobe functions to help them control their behavior? If the answer is no, then we're going to be talking about much more environmental cues and you modeling rather than helping to cue them to use their own skills. So here's the thing, and I think this is important to remember, and especially for clients in our system of care, across the United States, almost 13% of US adults have cognition issues. I mean, that's really high, right? People have significant difficulties concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. This is across all ages, right? And then about 7% of US adults have difficulty living independently, difficulty doing errands, right? And then 1 in 4 adults have some type of disability. So when we're working with people, and then you think about our population at DMHAS, and I know in doing a fair amount of neuropsychological evaluations that many people that were in our system of care, much, much higher than that 12.8, it was much more like 50, 60, 70% sometimes had cognitive disabilities. And so when we're working with people, we want to remember, oh yeah, they may have trouble remembering, they may have trouble hearing, listening, taking in the information. So just understanding that helps us to better consider how we want to intervene. So these numbers are high, right? I know it surprises many of us when we think about how many people are really struggling with cognitive challenges. So asking, when we're thinking about developing behavioral skills and de-escalation skills, are the antecedents, are the things that are happening before the behavior? That's the antecedents. What are the events and inner and outer experiences that are related to the event? Are they related to a person's disability, right? So, someone who is on the autism spectrum and a fire alarm goes off, right? Was that setting event, the fire alarm, related to the person's disability? And probably in that situation, if someone became agitated, we want to remember, oh yeah, there was a lot of stimulation on the unit. That's why I would often watch what was happening and just sit and observe stimulation, noise, interactions with other people, because sometimes the things that led to the behavior were often related to both the environment and the person's cognitive or developmental disability. Sensitivity to stimuli can make a big difference. And even for ourselves, right? Too much noise, temperature changes, etc. And there's often a higher probability of neurological compromise when someone has developmental disabilities. And then this last piece, awareness of deficits, right? How many people have you worked with that don't have full appreciation of some of their own deficits? So that too means that they're not going to be able to tell you that. They're not going to be able to tell you I'm overstimulated. Maybe they can, but often they can't. So we have to observe. And for us to observe, we have to really be listening and attuning. Now we're going to dive into emotion regulation, right? So Inside Out, which has been a great support for many clinicians and our kids. And one of my interventions at Whiting, I was working with a client who was on the autism spectrum and had a lot of difficulty regulating emotions, a lot of difficulty understanding other people's emotions. And we watched Inside Out. And it was actually really helpful to be able to just get some language, just to be able to understand our different parts of ourselves. And of course, hopefully many of you have seen the movie. I haven't seen part 2, but I've heard it's really good. And I have teenagers, so I know I need to see part 2. But this idea of being able to understand our different emotions that are coming and going, right? And to be able to help our clients identify them so that they know when to use different tools, right? And so we know there's like zones of regulation. There's different models, probably many of you are aware of. But really, if you think about what an important key this is to being able to be in the world, is the capacity to regulate our own emotions. So it's a foundation for positive pro-social behaviors based on a biopsychosocial model, and can be taught even when there's significant trauma or psychological impairment or cognitive impairment. That's the good news, right? So emotion regulation skills can be taught even when a person's had adverse early childhood events, trauma, etc. So what is emotion regulation? Really simply, it's the ability to manage and respond to emotional experiences, right? Our ability to effectively manage emotions and responding to them. So emotion dysregulation is the flip side, inability to regularly use healthy strategies to diffuse or moderate negative emotions. It can feel like an intense wave, right? Of anger, sadness, or panic. And goodness, all of us have had this, right? So it's not like, we're just all emotionally regulated, even if we're clinicians. We all have periods of emotion dysregulation and emotion regulation. But how often can we regain emotion regulation? And we're going to talk about that and how quickly we do that. And, how significant the dysregulation is really plays a role in how well we can adapt, right? And so often coping skills in emotion dysregulation are maladaptive because they can lead to things like self-injury or aggression. But interestingly, if we think about, and I'm going to go back to this slide for a second. I'm sorry to go backwards, but I want to just say that every behavior every behavior starts out adaptive. In other words, what might, seem very maladaptive at some point starts adaptive to help someone feel better, help them to communicate, help them to modulate, etc. Right? And so if we think about it that way, right, coping skills, even if they seem very maladaptive, were at one point helpful to a person, or still might be helpful to a person. Okay, sorry to do that, but I wanted to go back to that. Okay, so let's talk about what happens in the brain. And this is another thing that can be really helpful, is to think about not only just the behavior you're seeing, but what is happening in a person's neurologic system. It actually helps with empathy, believe it or not. When we can imagine the person in front of us who's really distressed, their brain is lighting up, particular parts of the brain, especially when they're feeling emotionally distressed. We've got a complex brain, all of us as humans. There's this circuits of interconnected regions of the brain that are always communicating. What happens when we're emotionally dysregulated is often the part of the brain that helps us to think, problem solve, perspective take, delay gratification, create impulse control delays, have empathy, recognize what the other person is saying. All of that is like the prefrontal, most of it is the prefrontal cortex. But what happens when people are distressed is that part of the brain sort of dims. Imagine it like a light circuit, right, in our brain. And when we're very distressed, the part of the brain that tells us all of that important information is sort of dialed down. And then the part of the brain that's in an active fight, flight, or freeze is very activated. So our brain is telling us, get out of the situation or fight, you're in danger. And that part of the brain that could help calm the brain down is not really working very well. And so what we often see, especially if someone's had a brain injury, for example, that they have prefrontal or frontal lobe damage, they aren't able to recruit the frontal lobes in a healthy way to be able to regain control. So when there's faulty wiring, so to speak, or chronic trauma where that brain has changed over time, it's much harder for people on their own to recruit their own sort of minds. So this is where a lot of support is needed. So when we're trying to think about emotion regulation, it's helpful to think about this sort of mind-body connection. And think about this for yourself. When we're faced with a demand or a stressor, right? Let's say we're going to work in the morning and there's traffic. So the stressor is traffic, and you're going to be late, and you're supposed to be logging on to a call with the Women's Consortium at 10. So we appraise the situation. Okay, am I going to get in trouble? Is this going to, be a problem, or is it no big deal? And, I can move on with my day once I get there, right? So we appraise the situation. And then if we decide that, oh no, this situation, this is terrible, I could get fired, something terrible is going to happen. If I get one more absence, I'm going to get demoted, whatever. We start to get overwhelmed, and that can cause that part of the brain, the limbic system, to go into activation. And it can create an imbalance in our sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. And too much of the sympathetic hyperarousal triggers fight or flight. So this happens to us on a regular basis, right? And so imagining for our clients as well, that the more this is happening, the more that they are feeling that things are not safe or stable, right? So our emotion regulation system really depends on how we're thinking about the situation. So here's another way of thinking about it, right? We have a potentially major stressful event. And then how we think about the situation. Is it controllable? Is it predictable? Is it something that we can manage, or are we overwhelmed? That is going to produce three things. One, an emotional response. Two, a physiological response. And three, a behavioral response. If it's a positive thing, if we think, oh yeah, like I'm giving a talk today and this talk's going to go great and I'm going to, really help people, we might feel happy, right? We might get a charge and feel really motivated and, feel good about ourselves. But for many of us, and especially for our clients, when they feel overwhelmed, when they feel like something bad is going to happen, it creates distress, physiological arousal, and then sometimes maladaptive coping skills. So I share this often in different talks I give, because I really like this idea of thinking about when someone is in distress, what's happening in their nervous system, and ourselves included. In the beginning today, I talked about the more that we can be grounded and stable, that people around us are going to respond in a similar way. There's this resonance we can create. Therapeutic presence really hinges upon being in our window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance and this whole nervous system comes from the neurobiology, this research, looking at people that have had trauma. So this goes to Besser van der Kolk's work and Dan Siegel and many of the neurobiologists that have looked at like what happens when there's stress in our system, especially on a repeated basis. So window of tolerance really is when we're in our optimal functioning, when we're like able to cope with stressors, when we're able to do our work, albeit not easy work, but when we're able to manage, day to day, we feel, okay, feel pretty stable. My body's relaxed. I'm, alert, focused. And then we get that jolt. We run into traffic. We see the red on our Google Maps and we're like, shit, I'm going to be really late. We go into the hyperarousal. We can start to get lots of negative thoughts. We do maybe a few breaths. We kind of get ourselves back down and we go back into our window of tolerance. But what happens for many of us, and especially for our clients, is that they have so many stressors happening. Their window of tolerance is already maybe not as robust, and people end up hanging out in this red zone more and more. And then we're more likely to see behavioral issues, right? The more that someone is distressed, the more that we're going to see some of those maladaptive coping skills coming out, right? And then if we go to the hypoarousal, right, this gray zone, this happens sometimes when we're shutting down, right? When there's too much stress. People have been living in this red zone for hours and hours and hours, and there's like a collapse. It's like, I can't cope anymore, right? So you can see behaviors on either end. Again, looking back at my CVH days, we'd often see folks would be really shut down, dissociating, spacey, apathetic, like not wanting to get out of bed. And if you trace it back, it is often after a lot of distress, right? So understanding the function of the behavior, but also understanding what is happening in the nervous system, both the client and our own nervous system. And so as you see on the slide, we have ways that we can continue to try to get back to our natural window of tolerance using mindfulness and grounding. I'm going to talk about a couple of other strategies as we go on today. So this slide shows about trauma. And so, of course, I'm speaking to folks that are very trauma informed here, right? But we can think about this window of tolerance and how it shrinks over time, and it doesn't take much to throw us off balance. And think about a stressful period in your own life. If you were going through an illness or caring for a loved one or someone, was moving that you didn't want, to leave, whatever the situation is, when there's been chronic stress, how it doesn't take much to throw us off balance. And that window of tolerance really starts to shrink, right? So working with a practitioner, of course, I'm preaching to this group that, working with mental health folks, working with mindfulness practitioners, helping people with auricular acupuncture. I got trained under the DMHAS grant many years ago with Alicia, and it's like amazing, right? These are ways to increase your window of tolerance, doing some of these mind-body techniques, right? That's why I am so, committed to having an integrative practice, because these things actually help with the window of tolerance. So this goes back to a little bit of the nervous system that I wanted to just highlight one more time, that under stress, our brain can change. Our prefrontal cortex, where we think and problem solve, can atrophy, which means it goes offline and can even almost shrink, and the part of the brain that is regulating our stress response gets overactive. And really, with too much stress over years and years, it really can change how the brain is functioning. We know this with the ACEs studies that can affect developmental trajectories for children, but as adults too, that too much stress can impact our cognition. So we want to help people to get back into their window of tolerance as quickly as possible. There's been some studies showing that when we're in a fight, flight, freeze, we lose about 25 IQ points. That's a lot, right? And this is on a good day, we need those 25 IQ points, right? And for our clients who may already be starting out with cognitive challenges, losing more capacity makes it even more difficult to intervene. So keeping people in their window of tolerance and you maintaining your own robust window of tolerance is really important. So think about it for a moment. How do I regain my control so I get back into my window of tolerance? What works for you? And you probably have lots of different skills that you use, but I think it's helpful sometimes to actually operationalize that for yourself so that you can access those skills more regularly. Because often it is when we're already way at like a 10 out of 10 where we realize, oh boy, I better start doing some techniques. But by that point, it can feel like it's a lot harder to regain control. When we have a jolt in our body, let's say, again, we see there's a huge red traffic tie-up and we are the presenter now. Let's jack up the intensity. So we're going to be late and we're the ones giving the talk. Yes, this has happened to me. When we really, really get distressed, it can take our body almost an hour when we get that jolt. Even if the stressor is removed, the traffic starts up again. Okay, I'm okay, I'll be on time. Even when that happens, right, our nervous system to actually metabolize the cortisol that's going through it takes about 45 minutes to an hour. So that's why people feel keyed up after a stressful event. So knowing all of that can really help you when you're interacting with other people too. Knowing that someone's not going to be able to regain control quickly. It may take quite a while before they feel back to their window of tolerance. So 45 minutes to an hour of quiet time could be so valuable rather than just pushing someone to go back into an activity if they're feeling really distressed. So I want to go through a little bit more about emotion regulation. So this work comes from Paul Gilbert, who, if you haven't found Paul Gilbert yet, I'd love you to find him. He's very quirky Scottish guy. He's older gentleman, older psychologist now. He created, and because he's in the UK, in the US, we weren't exposed to him as much. I wasn't anyway. He has a whole model of self-compassion psychotherapy. He's brilliant. He's a researcher and a clinician. And he talks about self-compassion and this whole body of research of how to use the nervous system and emotion regulation to help clients. His textbook, I've got it behind me somewhere, is so thick and very dense. But I love the next few slides because he talks about this idea that our nervous system has 3 components to it. So it's a little bit like the window of tolerance, but it's a slightly different lens. I just wanted to introduce you to it. He talks about how we have a threat system, a drive system, and a soothing system. And that throughout the day, we're sort of always using, or these different systems are always getting recruited, right? So the threat system, which could be external, like a due date, a deadline, or physical danger, or an internal threat, like, uh-oh, I did something wrong, they don't like me, I'm going to get dinged on my performance appraisal. We're kind of constantly responding to threats throughout the day. And think about life as a clinician, life as a manager, life running an agency. Pretty much throughout the day, you're getting dinged, these little external threats that are happening. I think about when I check my email or I'm working with clients, I mean, really, pretty much everything is a threat, right? Like, I mean, it's rare in mental health to get great news. We tend to get lots and lots of these threats that are happening. And it may not be a threat to our safety per se, but it's a threat because there's some problem that we need to address, which then produces drive state, drive state helps us to fix something, to achieve, to help, to pursue something, right? To learn. So drive is really helpful. And most of us are very happy in our comfort zone when we're in the drive state, right? And then there's like one other box, which is the soothing state. And for most of us, interestingly, the soothing part, the part that calms down, chills out, does our meditation and our breathing and yoga. I mean, some of us have that, but usually it's just a tiny, tiny portion of our day, week, month, or year. And so what Gilbert suggests is that often what happens, I just want to kind of go through this, is what most of us end up being is between drive and threat for most of our day. So most of the time, Paul talks about when people are in a threat zone, they go to drive. Problem, fix it. Problem, strive. Problem, learn more, do more, earn more. And we're constantly in this threat drive system. But we ping pong And what is happening to our poor little soothing, right? Our soothing system is offline. So the more that we're stuck ping-ponging between threat drive, threat drive, threat drive, our soothing system is not even activated, right? And so we kind of we get in a self loop. And so for many of us and our clients, we often this sort of system is designed to feel like we're never doing enough. And that's where that self-criticism, shame, self-hatred can happen. So I'm going to show you a little video, and it's a beautiful kind of, this is UK again, so you'll hear a British kind of voices and characters, but it also is for a gentleman who hears voices, how to think about bringing the soothing system online. I love this one. So I'm going to show you this. It's just about, I don't know, maybe 9 minutes, maybe not that long.
This is a film about Stuart. Stuart and his voices.
You can't do it today. You should do the way. Get up. Useless.
These circles represent our three major emotion systems and how they are balanced. The threat system kicks in.
They're coming for you. They've set you up. They know what you've done. They'll lock you up and never let you out. You might as well give up now. Is it too much? It's all too much. Pathetic.
Stuart's drive system comes online.
Come on, Stuart. They don't want you in the team. Miss, go on, miss.
Stuart is starting a therapy to help him cultivate compassion for himself, his feelings, and his voices.
Weak. You're weak for seeking therapy. You're weak. Be a man, walk away. Don't trust her.
Over time, Stuart's therapist gradually helps him to feel more safe. They practice exercises that help him feel more grounded and still. Slowing down his body using breathing and imagery, activating his soothing system. Stuart develops an image of an ideal, compassionate person, focusing on each of its compassionate qualities. He tries to imagine what it would be like to step into this image and become this compassionate person. He walks around, acting the part of his compassionate self, getting a sense of what that would feel like, how he would think, what he would do. He practices at home as well, and gradually begins to deepen his understanding and sense of his compassionate self. As Stuart feels safer, stronger, and more courageous, he decides to start a conversation from his compassionate self to his most critical voice.
Hello. What do you want, loser? I want to understand you. I want to help you feel safe. Safe? Nothing's safe round here. If it wasn't for me, you'd be... I know you're trying to help me. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me that I get scared. You're right, I do. But I want to start overcoming my fears now. I'm ready. You want to get rid of me. No, I don't. I don't want to get rid of anyone. We can work on this together.
Hearing voices is a common human experience. It can often be linked to something difficult or painful that's happened in the past. Although tricky at times, with lots of practice and encouragement, Stuart's compassionate self becomes better developed.
Danger! Back to bed. You're not ready. It's okay, guys. Thanks for the warning. I'll keep an eye out, but there's things I need to do today. Hey, it's all right. We can manage this. We'll see. Hey.
Stuart now feels safe in relation to his voices. He understands and accepts them. They're very much part of the family, but no longer running the show. With his compassionate self in the driving seat, Stuart can now follow his true desires.
I think that, of course, this is one example of how to bring the soothing system online, even for something more significant, more serious and persistent, like hearing voices. And it also helps about our own system too, right? Because even if we're not hearing actual voices, the internal dialogue, right? Those threats that we're constantly kind of our automatic negative thoughts, we do need to do a little bit of what Stuart is doing too, right? To be able to use our wise self, to be able to get back into our soothing system. So we often have underdeveloped soothing systems as humans, right? I would say that, we try to teach our kids and try to teach them around emotion regulation, but we reinforce the drive state and we often don't do a lot about the soothing state. So that's another piece to thinking about when we're working with clients that have a lot of emotion regulation challenges. How well developed are their soothing skills and how can we make that more robust? Okay. I want to just do a couple of brief practices that can be helpful for you and helpful for your clients when you're working with them or your staff if they're in difficult situations. And these are very easy ones, but the idea is how can I bring soothing in a flash, in a moment when I'm feeling really distressed? I practice this one a lot. I do this with lawyers. I work with lawyers as Marissa was sharing in the beginning, and I often work with lawyers who have a lot of imposter syndrome, performance anxiety. They go into a courtroom and they're feeling really dysregulated. And they can't just sit and meditate and, that they have to actually perform. And so this is a really helpful technique, 2 feet, 1 breath. It's a way to get right into our kind of back grounded into presence. And it also helps if we're starting to go into that threat hyperarousal state. So let's just practice it together. And I'm going to ask you actually to do it in a kind of a simple way, but I'm going to have you, if you're comfortable, closing your eyes for a moment. And think about a situation that's mildly stressful. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 1 or a 2. Traffic, a little argument you have with somebody. Just notice how that affects you. Notice if you feel some tension in the body. Maybe imagining that situation and what it was like. Who was there? Now I'm going to invite you to just take your attention to your foot and press down into your left foot. Just simply press down and notice all the muscles engaging in your left foot, your lower leg, upper leg, sitting bones. And then relax the left leg. And then pressing into the right foot, activating all the muscles in the right lower leg, upper leg. And then relaxing the right leg. And then taking a breath. And then opening your eyes and just noticing how you feel. And you may have noticed that while you were focusing on your feet and your breathing, that worry shifted, that threat system that might have been engaged just stopped. The mind will often, go toward the sensations in the body if we can bring our attention there, right? So where the, kind of our attention goes, the energy flows. It's like a yoga expression, but I like it in terms of this too, with emotion regulation. If we're placing our attention on our feet and the sensations in our feet and legs, our awareness goes there rather than the perseveration that might be happening in our minds. So this is a very helpful one, just to kind of snap us back into the present moment. Second one, many of you have seen this, is foundation of many kinds of de-escalation practices. It's the stop technique. I used to laminate the stop sign and show this and have clients use this, right? Have it in their pocket just to remember. And similarly to the 2 feet, 1 breath, it's just a way to come back into the present moment quickly. One of the things that's so helpful is to actually stop what you're doing. Like if you are getting really activated, let's say you have to respond to an email or you're working with a client and everything is kind of blowing up. If we keep doing what we're doing, the likelihood is we're going to remain in that heightened threat response. So by stopping for a moment of whatever the activity is and taking a pause and then focusing on the breath, noticing the breath coming in through the nose, out through the mouth, observing if there's tension in the body. Sometimes I'll remind myself and other people, relax the shoulders and the hands. And then even inviting this question, how do I want to proceed? When we ask ourselves that question, we're recruiting the frontal lobes. Remember how the frontal lobes go offline when someone is dysregulated. We want to get those frontal lobes back online. I was working with a law student, another kind of group I work with, and this woman had had a lot of trauma. And she was in a class where she, in one of her lawyer classes where they were talking about trauma. And so because she had had trauma and then she's hearing about case law around trauma, she was really getting activated and she'd go into a fight, flight, freeze. So I had her practice a couple of these techniques. Then I had her literally look around the room. This was a practice, and count how many people were wearing blue shirts, white shirts, red shirts, and make a little tally. Now, it's kind of pointless, right? But the idea was to get her back into the present moment, to use her senses to regain control. And so that was often a way to help people go from that fight, flight, reactive threat system back into a more stable window of tolerance, and then even some soothing by bringing breath and compassion in, right? So these are 2 quick ways to think about how to regain control, bring in some soothing into the system when someone's activated. And it doesn't have to be like 7 sessions of compassion focused therapy, which would be great, but it can be very short. Other techniques, sometimes I'll do this. This is a really helpful one, hand on the heart, which can actually initiate positive hormones. So self-touch, soothing touch can be really helpful in terms of allowing the body to go into more of a soothing state, right? So there's been research showing that touch can actually initiate oxytocin, which is the feel-good hormone, right? So hand on the heart or 2 hands on the heart. Sometimes when someone is a trauma survivor, we'll place a hand on the back of the neck and the hand on the forehead. You can try it. You can feel really, really gentle. And these are ways, just feel it yourself, taking a few breaths. Can feel like, oh, yeah, a little bit of soothing there, right? So our own soothing touch, and there's different ones people can do, but I usually do hand on the heart, or sometimes that one. And sometimes I'll do a hand on the cheek. That's another one. It can be very gentle. And so that actually can bring that soothing in. And when we bring soothing online, it helps us to get back into our window of tolerance, and it helps us get out of that kind of fight flight system. Okay, again, I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions before we go into our proactive and reactive strategies. So just again, I'll keep recapping so that you can see these puzzle pieces coming together. We talked about therapeutic presence. Then we talked about the functions of behavior and the brain. We talked about emotion regulation, the threat, drive, soothing system, and the window of tolerance, ways to help people to regain their window of tolerance, come back into window of tolerance. Now we're going to talk a little bit more behavioral again in the context of those other strategies. So proactive and reactive strategies. So when someone's in a crisis, there are different times that we can intervene, right? So this is a crisis cycle. Some of you may have seen that, right? From 1 to 7 with different points of intervention. Now, Some of the work we do, when we talked about therapeutic presence today, we're talking about when we're at a 1, when we're just kind of interacting, we're developing rapport. Maybe we're practicing breathing techniques with clients or doing some of the skill building. So we want to ideally do proactive interventions as much as we can so that we don't even get into the crisis cycle, or that we can prevent it from going all the way up, right? So some of our interventions, particularly proactive, are happening around a 1 or a 2. Once we start to accelerate into a crisis, we can still intervene, but then it becomes more reactive. When it is more reactive, it takes longer to get someone back into their window of tolerance. There's less skill building, and it is less effective, although still needed at times. Less effective because we lose our IQ points when we're more distressed. The more someone's in a crisis, the more dangerous it becomes, and the harder it is for people to regain control. Remember what I said earlier? Sometimes it takes 45 minutes to an hour before the cortisol is metabolized in the body. So what does that mean? It means that the more we can be proactive, the less we have to be reactive, which is less effective anyway. So proactive interventions are designed to prevent problem behaviors, whereas reactive, we're not even really looking at prevention, right? Because we're just already in it. Proactive, we're emphasizing teaching behaviors. Like Stuart, in our little video, his clinician was teaching him, right? So that's great. Although he was a little bit activated in the session, she was emphasizing teaching behaviors. Reactive, there's little focus on teaching, right? It's just trying to find calm stability. Proactive, we're reinforcing the desired behaviors, whereas reactive, we're often punitively responding. Sometimes, and again, back to my CVH days, I remember one of the head nurses, this is very early in this is probably like, I don't know, day 5 of my job at CVH. He came in and he said, "Doc, we got to get a behavioral management program. We got to stop these behaviors. And so immediately that was a reactive kind of message. I need to come up with reactive strategies. And that wasn't wrong, right? But what happens is that would have very limited capacity to help the person change their behaviors. So there is room for reactive, but we want to think about in general, when we're de-escalating, that a lot of the work is proactive. So what is a toolbox for proactive interventions? Pro being our operative word. We want to avoid provocations and triggers. The more that we understand the functions of behavior, this goes back to the second piece that I was talking about today, understanding what might evoke the behavior, understanding the functions of the behavior, that really helps. Setting events, helping to create an environment that is less likely to activate somebody, prompting and cueing someone rather than just assuming the person knows what to do, setting expectations proactively. When I was working with my mom with the daughter that didn't want to go to kindergarten, we really worked on how can she talk to her daughter about it's going to be a great day. You're going to see Mrs. Jones when you go inside. You're going to see your little friend Julie, and you guys are going to have a snack. Then you're going to take a nap. Then you're going to So that's setting expectations proactively. Keeping a routine. I mean, this is true for all of us, honestly, right? When we have a routine, we have a schedule, that really helps our nervous system to stay online, right? Helps our frontal lobes to stay online, helps us to know what to expect, and that creates a sense of safety. So the more that we do this, right, doesn't it make sense that some of the problem behaviors are less likely to occur? Not 100%, of course. Directions. This goes back to the brain piece. So if we think about many of the people that we work with, that we serve, have some kind of cognitive limitation, we want to make sure that the directions we're giving are concrete and specific, right? And so we're not going to want to give really complex, you have to do this, do that. I mean, I've done DBT sometimes with clients that have cognitive impairments, and it can be really hard to do a chain behavior or to do some of the tools, right? So how do we make sure that the language and the tools are concrete to help someone really learn them? We want to be sensitive to people that have different learning styles or different capacities to tolerate environments. So I love these hands-on approaches. Like the hands-on approach may be not simply telling someone use your breathing, but it might be just doing it together. And I will always, when I'm teaching somebody about a breathing technique or a soothing technique, right, I'll do it with them so that they're not just being taught, but we're doing it together. And that really helps as well. And then this sort of team approach where everyone is doing the same thing. We're all reinforcing how it can help John, you know, to keep a calm voice. All of us can remind John, okay, John, let's feel our feet on the floor. Let's take a few moments to breathe, so that when we're all doing the same intervention, it can really be helpful for de-escalation. Active listening. So again, we talked about this in terms of the therapeutic rapport, but really listening to what the person needs and wants. You know, when people are distressed, we often forget about like things like what gives them quality of life, right? We used to think about this on the inpatient unit a lot. Like if someone doesn't have anything that makes them feel good or to look forward to in their daily life, like they're, you know, the idea of wanting to even work for something or to regulate emotions, what's the point, right? So finding enough quality of life activities, and this is true for us too, right? When we don't have anything to look forward to, when it feels like all we're doing is working, it's hard to regulate our emotions. We don't feel particularly enthusiastic about doing a meditation practice or adding yet another to-do list item, right? So we want to make sure that there's like a sense of the bigger picture. I was working, again, another lawyer example. I was working with a lawyer who was really stressed out. She was working 60 to 70 hours every week, no weekend time. And, you know, she said, I'm living on the margins. And she was having panic attacks. So we talked about, okay, so living on the margins and, you know, not having time for yourself. Yes, she's doing a great job. So she's in that like threat drive sort of conundrum, but she has nothing soothing going on and nothing to even look forward to. And so you can imagine over and over again how much that would impact someone's ability to regain emotional control. So we have to think about that quality of life, right? For us, for our clients, do I have enough time and space for myself? And if I don't, what are ways that I can give myself preferred quiet time? Doing fresh activities, things I haven't done in a while. You know, one of my goals, I was thinking about this myself, right? Like Sundays, I don't know how you all feel about it, but right, Sundays when you're trying to get a million things done, laundry, oh my God, right, we can go on and on. And I decided for myself one way that I could make sure that I had quiet time was to get a hard copy of the New York Times, because I stopped doing that like when everything went online and I'd read, like scroll an article. So I get the hard copy of the New York Times now, and I made a goal for myself to be able to just read it on a Sunday, which takes a long time because there are a lot of sections. And I'm finding it so enjoyable and challenging to get through it, but it gives me the space of not doing anything else and to really nurture myself. And so it's been a challenge because it can take a good couple hours at least. So what is your version of that? And what are your clients' versions of that, right? So these are different things. And we often talked about this on the inside, on the inpatient unit, that when we give directions, we sometimes give directions like stop doing that, don't do that. And instead to think about what we want to see the person do, right? So if someone's yelling, we don't want to say stop talking or stop yelling. We want to say, yeah, can you use your inside voice? You know, not stop being agitated, but let's relax with slow breathing. Our brains do better when we know what we're supposed to do rather than stopping a behavior. Small steps, not using words like appropriate, or that can just really activate people, right? So we want to really make sure our directions are concrete, they're understandable, especially when someone's agitated. We don't want to use language that, you know, may even be more activating, right? So feeling one foot on the floor, feeling the other foot on the floor, reminding people, modeling for people. Those are all ways that we can set proactive expectations. Giving people choices. So 2 or 3 choices, really helpful when someone is agitated, right? So rather than just feeling stuck. And if those choices hopefully are not ones like you're going to go into restraints, this is what I used to hear on the unit. You could either go into restraints or You can sit in that corner, they'd be like terrible options. Like, well, we would rather that the choices be, you can go in and listen to some music, or, we can do some gentle breathing together. We can watch a TV show, right? Reinforcement, honestly, this, for kids, for each other, we have to give each other a lot of reinforcement, right? That really helps. When we get a positive reinforcement, the brain lights up, right? It feels good. And we get some of that oxytocin, that feel-good hormone going through our bodies. And then also, when someone does something positive, helping them to look at that and say, hey, what does that be? If someone was able to regain control, like Stuart in the video, hey, Stuart, what does that say for yourself? That you were able to, get through that difficult situation. And he might say, oh, I have good control today, or something like that. And even if a person's not being able to do it 100%, to reward even little approximations to that goal. Other proactive emotional regulation practices. I love DBT as long as the person has the cognitive capacity to understand. So I like to take pieces of DBT, even if I'm not doing DBT proper, right? Like doing some of the skill building, like the ABCs, helping people find fun and pleasurable activities, or building mastery. So if you haven't looked at your DBT skills in a while, there's some really helpful ones that do relate to emotion regulation and some of the de-escalation. So those are nice skill building exercises you can do with clients, and even just taking them and making them really simple can be helpful. I have sometimes people come up with slogans to say to themselves, like, I'm safe, I can get through this, so that they can get that soothing system back online, right? And so that's very DBT-esque. It's another slide around, please, just this remembrance of our physical eating. A couple of my patients, sometimes that morning routine, I really focus on the proactive morning routine to set the day up, which is involving eating and taking time for some movement. Okay, part 5, last part, and then we'll take some time for questions. Crisis management. So sometimes we need to be reactive, right? So the idea when we're looking at behavioral control, when we're looking at the whole de-escalation, we want this to ideally only be about 5 to 10% of the time, remembering that we're less likely to get benefit when someone is agitated. We lose these 25 IQ points, right? So the more that we can help someone in the early stages, when there's some mild activation or no activation at all, that's our goal. But we do have to do reactive strategies sometimes, right? So let's go through some ideas. So when we're in crisis management, you guys have gone through this before, this is kind of some of the basics of the CSS and some of the other strategies, but active listening comes back in here too, right? Sometimes to diffuse negative experiences, we need to just listen, attune, and give undivided attention. And showing you care without necessarily agreeing with what a person is saying, but just showing that natural empathy can make a big difference. So the validation, rather than correcting, is really helpful when someone is upset. Whether you totally disagree with what they're saying, even if it's directed toward you, like, you're such a da-da-da, I hear you, I hear how upsetting this is. Like, and just to continue to do that piece can help people, so naming something, just naming it for them, like, yeah, this sounds so frustrating for you. That can help turn the frontal lobes back on and de-escalate a little bit of that limbic system arousal. So we don't want to obviously use physical interventions whenever possible. And some of you are in settings where you can't use them, so that's not even appropriate, right? But we want to think about, when we're in a crisis, safety, connection, and empowerment. Those are our 3 goals. Safety first. We have to make sure that people are safe. And then connecting, going back to our therapeutic relationship. And then how do we empower the client, like Stuart, to regain control using soothing strategies, using some of the DBT-like skills, right? So safety first, connection, empowerment. So we want to be showing, we want to look at our safety, right? We want to think about concern, keeping ourselves regulated. So we may be doing our 2 feet, 1 breath over and over again when someone's agitated. You are human and you are going to feel it. When someone is upset, absolutely, our system goes into that same system the client is, or maybe, you know, its own unique little brand of it. But I know I do when someone's agitated. So back into the present moment, focusing on, okay, what matters most to you right now? And really being a hope merchant. Hey, I know you know, this is hard. We're going to help regain control together, right? So giving a person hope. We want to be as consistent and steady as possible. So our own body language, right? So not engaging in unpredictable movements. If someone's trying to self-soothe, we let them soothe, right? Ignoring the self-talk if someone's using lots of negative language toward you or toward themselves, just letting some of that play out. We know it takes some time for their system to come back in. So, you know, it's kind of like this hands off in some ways and just holding a safe container for the person as much as possible if the person isn't getting more agitated. All right, so that is the end of my piece. So, you know, as we've gone through sort of these 6 or 5 different pieces of the big puzzle, and all of you are familiar probably with each of these, but imagining this more holistic approach for when you're de-escalating behaviors or where you're training staff around that, to see about which may be one of those areas that you might do a little bit more on for yourself or for the people you're working with.